Howdy there, friends, family, adversaries, ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary folks. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Riley Constantine, and today we are reviewing Godzilla vs. Kong, which is the recently released blockbuster sequel to both Godzilla King of the Monsters and Kong Skull Island that pits both Godzilla and Kong against each other. Obviously. It should be a fun, spoiler-free episode, so without further ado, here we go. Godzilla vs. Kong is exactly what I'd want out of an action kaiju blockbuster. It has colossal monster fights, narrative surprises, and some ludicrous action set pieces, and all in all, it is overall a good action film that features plenty of silly cornball entertainment that made me smile with glee. Like, for hell's sake, Godzilla throws a monster through a skyscraper, and Kong tosses haymakers like it's going out of style, and it's all just pretty damn awesome. Yet with that being said, the most important aspect of Godzilla vs. Kong has little to do with the action. While for sure seeing Kong shove a boat down Godzilla's gullet like a mom forcing vegetables into a toddler's mouth is a riot, the real surprise has less to do with the action and more to do with the empathetic character development. And yes, I know that the characters in this film have been roundly criticized, but please hear me out, okay? See, some parts of Godzilla vs. Kong's narrative focus on King Kong and some of the human characters. In fact, the movie places an emphasis on the character interactions between Kong and some of our human avatars, and as a result, the movie's story and ludicrous action is actually worth getting invested in. There's a reason for the audience to give a damn about the two giant monsters fighting each other and the human characters that must cower from them. Which is a welcome surprise, seeing as the human characters in the previous Monsterverse film, Godzilla King of the Monsters, were fairly lacking. While I understand that many Godzilla fans loved that movie due to how its action was undeniably awesome, the human characters were sadly fairly flat, especially in comparison to the kaiju monsters literally chewing up the scenery. For sure, Godzilla King of the Monsters had a lot of flair, but it lacked a reason to care. It lacked emotional resonance. Thankfully, Godzilla vs. Kong's story establishes this much-needed personal connection. The plot follows Nathan Lind, who is a scientist trying to prove his theory that titans like Godzilla and King Kong originated from Hollow Earth, which is a gorgeous monster-filled locale that theoretically exists deep inside the Earth. To many people in Godzilla vs. Kong's universe, it is a radical theory, but the totally not shady Apex Cybernetics CEO, Walter Simmons, believes him, and hires Nathan to head an exposition equipped with futuristic technology in order to dive into the theoretical Hollow Earth and find a potential new power source that would make oil obsolete, which is a mission that can only go well. However, Lind's plan has a problem. See, every human expedition sent to Hollow Earth never survives the trip, and in order to embark on a successful venture, Lind needs a kaiju to lead him and his team down there. So in his quest, Nathan recruits King Kong expert Eileen Andrews and her adoptive daughter Gia, who has a special connection of trust with King Kong, in order to use the giant gorilla kaiju Kong to guide and protect the expedition, which in and of itself is a difficult task. After all, prodding a giant prehistoric giant gorilla to do one's bidding would take a Herculean effort, and any potential monkey wrench, pun intended, would derail the expedition and complicate the problem. So of course, Godzilla comes into the plot to derail the expedition and complicates the problem. See, in the previous Godzilla film, the plot placed a heavy emphasis on how Godzilla needed to swing his big old lizard dick around and be recognized as the king of the monsters by all other kaiju on Earth, and if any of the monsters objected, it would hurt his feelings and thus he would fight them to the death, though they are allowed to tap out if they want to. By the end, Godzilla fights a lot of monsters, most of which are far more villainous than him, and wins, becoming the true king of the monsters. However, this victory comes with an asterisk. Godzilla never fought King Kong for the right to be atop the monster monarchy, mostly because Kong was being protected from Godzilla by being placed in a human sanctuary. But when Lind springs Kong loose, all bets are off and the rambunctious Godzilla comes after Kong with extreme prejudice. Thus we have the heavyweight March Madness fight of the century in Godzilla vs. Kong to determine who is the stronger monster. And it's all pretty great. The fights between Godzilla and Kong are very inventive, polished, and have incredible detail, though there is admittedly one minor issue, mostly in how the film's name of Godzilla vs. Kong is a bit of a misnomer. While the film for sure contains plenty of moments where the two titans duke it out in the form of highly polished visual effects spectacle, there is a bit of a lie in the movie's title. See, Godzilla vs. Kong is much more a King Kong movie than a Godzilla feature. Despite how Godzilla receives first billing, Kong has much more screen time and the movie is much more a Kong Skull Island sequel than a follow-up to King of the Monsters. See, throughout the film, Kong goes on a nice character arc that reflects interesting themes regarding the exploitative nature of colonialism. Yes, really, you didn't think the filmmakers were going to ignore that elephant in the room, did ya? And director Adam Wingard was right to put this spotlight on Kong, mostly because out of the two monsters, Kong is far more emotive and can convey a lot more empathy, especially seeing as he can communicate with Eileen and her adoptive daughter Gia. And because of this, Kong and the human characters directly impact the plot and Kong's character development, which in turn allowed me to get invested in the narrative and the characters, between the human connection, Kong's human sympathies, and how I legitimately felt bad for how humans were abusing Kong's trust in order to invade his homeland for resources, because once again, colonialism. This was all enough of an emotional anchor for me to become attached to the film's action and plot. The characters in Kong work because they have emotional range and have agency in the narrative, and as a result, the movie is really good and reflects that this is a King Kong story more so than a Godzilla one, which is unfortunately a fact that is reflected in one of Godzilla vs. Kong's biggest flaws. See, the more Godzilla-focused characters are far less interesting. As you likely discerned from the trailers, Millie Bobby Brown's Madison Russell character returns after being one of the main protagonists in Godzilla King of the Monsters, but sadly, she's kind of useless in Godzilla vs. Kong. While for sure it is neat that the film is using her character to bridge the interconnected continuity of the Monsterverse together, Madison's character arc in Godzilla vs. Kong is basically non-existent. Essentially, she, Brian Tyree Henry's Bernie Hayes, and Julian Dennison's Josh Valentine investigate Apex Cybernetics for some really shady shenanigans, which is all fine and good as far as story progression goes, but the issue is that Russell and company don't really have arcs to speak of where they grow as people. In fact, they only really serve one purpose narratively, and that is to give the audience a point of view of plot-important details, and sadly, that's it, really. Instead of showing us how they change as people throughout the film, these characters just act as an excuse to give us a ground floor perspective of overarching plot developments that play into Godzilla's overarching theme about humans facing violent repercussions for exploiting nature, which taken by itself is all fine and cool. After all, messages about how we shouldn't mess with nature or weapons of mass destruction are important themes in Hellscape circa 2021. But with that said, I wish that the characters delivering this message in Godzilla vs. Kong had more agency in the narrative. If anything, Madison Russell and company are pointless in this movie and add so little to the story, and thus they are the movie's biggest flaw. Speaking of flaws, some of the pacing is a bit off as well. In fact, the first third of Godzilla vs. Kong is mostly action-free, and while that's not necessarily a bad thing, in fact, whetting the audience's appetites and building up the stakes and tension can be a good idea overall, the movie spends far too much time with explaining overbearingly dull exposition and giving too much screen time to a certain subset of characters, i.e. the aforementioned Madison Russell crew that have little control or agency in the events of the narrative. And as a result, clearly some things about the film should have been cut differently or been rewritten entirely so that the focus could be properly placed on Godzilla vs. Kong's two most interesting aspects, which is to say the epic kaiju battles between Kong and Godzilla, and the character growth between Kong, Eileen, Gia, and Lind that touches on some deeper and interesting themes. Godzilla vs. Kong is at its best when it focuses on both the epic action and the growth of some of the characters, and one famous giant ape in particular. And as a result, overall, Godzilla vs. Kong is worth recommending. Sure, the pacing is off at times and some of the characters are too one-dimensional, but the amazingly cool kaiju fights and the character development between Kong and many of the humans are interesting enough to get engaged in the narrative. Godzilla vs. Kong is overall a good and fun, albeit imperfect, blockbuster spectacle that's truly awesome to take in when it is firing on all cylinders. I definitely recommend it despite reservations. Also, it has a giant ape fighting a giant lizard, so what's there not to love about that? And with that, that was the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating and subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment telling me what you thought about Godzilla vs. Kong, and also please consider donating to my Patreon page. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my high tier patrons in Slasher Vales, Mom, David Devlin, and Miles Nelson. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.